Good evening. Before we begin our discussion of the six capitals, I'd like to provide you with a brief history behind the movement of the transparent corporation, that as corporate stewards and fiduciaries, you will engage in a way never before seen in American corporate history. As I mentioned, this is a shot around the world, but from my perspective, I'm not at all certain it is grabbing the attention of today's corporate CEOs in a way that it is around the world, and especially as it occurred in the South African Stock Exchange. So let's start with some of the early work in this area. And again, this is recent times. Let's introduce the year 1999 in Joan, Bavaria. Joan had just been named a hero for the planet by Time magazine while working as an investment officer at the Bank of Boston. She founded the first socially responsible investment company and a socially responsible investment fund by 1981. Now, as you may recall, 10 years earlier, in 1989, that was the year of the environmental catastrophe, the Exxon Valdez oil spill. This is probably before your time, but this was the tanker that ran aground in Prince William Sound off the coast of Alaska and spilled up to 750,000 barrels of crude oil into the Sound. 25 years later, that region has still not recovered. And then, of course, in your generation, you were introduced to the Deepwater Horizon environmental disaster in 2010. It rivaled and perhaps even surpassed the destruction caused by the Exxon Valdez tanker. But as a result of the first disaster, as reported by Jane Gleason White, the question that Bavaria asked was whether companies have an affirmative duty, an affirmative obligation to go beyond the profit-focused principles of U.S. case law. That was a case decided many, many years ago that established a long time ago by Dodge versus Ford that the profit focus was the sole motivation of the company. So Bavaria asked, and Jane asked, was the profit motive the only motive that shareholder investors and the community of stakeholders could hope for? While there are a lot of iterations, in general from that disaster 25 years ago emerged an organization called Ceres. And on its 25th anniversary in 2014, the director said, 25 years ago, the whole idea of having an environmental ethic or measuring your performance above and beyond your legal requirements was considered insane, completely insane. But there were a couple of visionaries like Joan Bavaria and others who believed it could happen, that it should happen. And as Jane Gleason White in her book, Six Capitals, or Can Accountants Save the Planet, tells the story very, very well. We can diary forward to a few years later, and a new organization was established called the Global Reporting Initiative. It was based on Bavaria's and other thought leaders. The guidelines of GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, were focused on environment, social responsibility, and governance. And that's actually the origin when you hear the terms ESG. That's the origin of the term, environment, social responsibility, and governance issues. One of the turning points in the evolution of GRI occurred in 2002 when the United Nations held a World Summit on Sustainable Development. And as a result, Global Reporting Initiative, the GRI, came under the direction of the United Nations Environmental Program. And it was clear, like we talked about, the United Nations realized that corporations may impact society and the economy in far greater ways than most countries. And again, those statistics that 52 of the largest economies of the world are not nations, but multinational corporations. So GRI opened its doors in Amsterdam in 2002 and focused on its charter. Sustainable development, sustainability performance measures, triple bottom line reporting, and corporate values such as brand image and reputation. As Alan White of the Telus Institute, which is one of the founders of GRI, said in 2009, we built GRI in the belief that a globalized world needs a generally accepted global standard for non-financial reporting to achieve the accountability and transparency that all stakeholders need and deserve. And a decade after its inception, and in the wake of the global economic crisis in 2009, driven in large measure by what he called the breakdown of accountability and transparency, as White said, this core belief has never been more compelling. In this regard, I'd like to talk a little about Mervyn King's background. We've seen him before in a couple of presentations and videos. But Mervyn King, at the age of 40, became the youngest ever judge appointed to the Supreme Court of South Africa, and the youngest Supreme Court justice, frankly, ever to resign. Mervyn King, a brilliant lawyer, assumed the chair of GRI in 2002 because in South Africa he had been responsible for a series of corporate governance initiatives called the King Code of Corporate Governance, under which all public companies in South Africa were responsible for adhering to. Now in 2013, the GRI developed specific standard disclosures called the G4. This is only 2 or 3 years ago. The G4 focuses on the following, and it's something foreign, I believe, to corporate enterprise in the United States. The G4 states that there is an expectation that long-term profitability should go hand in hand with social justice and protecting the environment. Now, these expectations are only set to increase and intensify as the need to move to a truly sustainable economy is understood by companies and organizations, financiers, customers, and other stakeholders. Now, this is a concept not necessarily that is necessarily foreign in the United States, but it's a practice that is beginning to spread around the world when you think of sustainable companies. Now, there are other movements as well that we could talk about. And as Jane Gleason White puts it, that the United Nations aligned itself with the private sector and its market thinking was not without grounds. The UN formally acknowledged the growing significance of the private sector and the importance of fostering collaborations with business. So the Global Compact was created, a new organization. It was the first United Nations initiative in its 55-year history with a specific focus on the private sector. The United Nations then expanded its new vision of private enterprise, according to White, and now directed it at investors. So in 2006, the equivalent of the Global Compact was focused on investors, and the initiative was called the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investing. And there are 6 principles, and I think it's important that we recall these because you may be asked to comment on them as corporate fiduciaries, as stewards of the corporation, or as corporate legal counsel. These are the 6 principles that investors pledge to incorporate into their decision-making, including environmental, social, and governance, which we said, of course, is ESG issues, into investment analysis and decision-making. And as active owners, incorporate ESG issues into ownership policies and practices. And also to look at the appropriate disclosure on ESG issues by the entities they invest in. To promote the principles with the investment community, implement the principles effectively, and report on their progress. This is still not being done. By April 2014, 8 years after its launch, it had more than 1,260 signatories, representing over $45 trillion in assets under management. As Jean Gleason White puts it, this is about 15% of the world's total investable assets. And today, the Global Compact has over 12,000 participants, including more than 8,000 businesses in 15 countries, making it the largest voluntary corporate sustainability initiative in the world. There's another organization as well called the International Integrated Reporting Council. That was born in August of 2010, principally as a result of the Prince Charles initiative called the Prince's Accounting for Sustainability Project. As Prince Charles said, the world has never faced such challenge. Now, this is right after the global meltdown. The world has never faced such challenges, he declared. We are battling 21st century challenges with at best 20th century decision-making and reporting systems. In December 2013, in what Jane Gleason White calls the holy grail of integrated reporting, the International Integrated Reporting Council, the IIRC, published an online framework to present what they called a new way of business thinking. According to the IIRC, an integrated report aims to provide insight about the resources and relationships used and affected by an organization. These are collectively referred to as the capitals in this framework. And here we have the connection, 2013 December, between corporate governance and the 6 capitals. Let's talk a little further about the IIRC because it's fascinating. The IIRC comprises regulators, shareholders, accounting professionals, and others from 25 countries around the world. Together, they believe that communication about value creation should be the next step in the evolution of corporate reporting, and that integrated reporting and integrated thinking comes from Mervyn, can improve the allocation of financial capital or investment in business, and in doing so bring greater financial stability and sustainable futures to the entity. Not surprising, in 2011, Mervyn was appointed IIRC chairman, and Paul Druckmann was named chief executive officer. I had the honor of meeting Paul Druckmann for breakfast when he was in New York last year. And from my perspective, from my discussion with him, was that he viewed the United States as a pretty hard nut to crack when it came to discussing corporate governance and reporting on the 6 capitals in the States. Clearly, he saw this as an evolutionary process, not as a revolutionary one. But again, this is just my opinion. And it's up to you in the future years that you work in corporate America to see whether we could see this is an evolutionary or a revolutionary future. As we lead into our discussion of the 6 capitals, I think it is relevant to discuss the IIRC framework. There are 8 content elements, and I think as corporate fiduciaries and stewards, this is tremendously important to think about in your new roles. These content elements are all inextricably linked. Again, it's the integrated thinking, the integrated reporting that's so critical to the transparency to stakeholders of the corporation. Here are the 8 content elements: organizational overview and external environment, governances, business model, risk and opportunities, strategy, resource allocation, performance outlook, and the basis of preparation and reporting. Regarding business models, I think we have to just focus a little on this. As Jane Gleason White puts it, the term business model became popular in use in the 90s with the rise of online electronic commerce. You see, IIRC's version of their business model is literally a stylized spider, and you've seen it in some previous slides from Mervyn and Michael Creighton and others. The model draws on the various capitals as inputs and then converts them to outputs, such as goods and services, byproducts, and waste, which then leads to outcomes. Outcomes affect the capitals, both those internal to the business, such as employees or its store of financial capital, as well as external, such as the natural environment or society. An outcome might be, for example, a better trained workforce. It would positively affect human capital, but its training costs would negatively affect financial capital. Pollution of a river to create goods is a negative effect on natural capital and a positive effect on financial capital. But this value creation model focuses on outcomes, and that's the reason for discussing the 6 capitals. So it is different from the traditional business model that I studied in school and that is currently being studied in B schools. But the critical importance of the value creation model is that it is used to help stewards and fiduciaries of the company determine whether, in the end, the outcomes that are generated create positive financial and non-financial value for the long-term sustainability of the enterprise. The question that you're going to be asked is from the corporate fiduciary perspective. Does this increase the value and the long-term sustainability of the company, or does it decrease the value or the wealth of the company? Does it increase the environmental, social, and governance behavior and value of the company, or does it decrease it? So let's take a look now at the six capitals.